So let's start. Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here with us. Let me introduce myself. I am Daniela Di Bucci from the Italian Civil Protection Department, and I'm the coordinator of the project Roadmap 2, European Observatory on Disaster Risk and Crisis Management Best Practices Way Ahead. I will start this webinar with a short presentation of the project, and then I'll leave the floor to Katy Oro, who will manage, will rule and drive this activity. But just a few words from a technical point of view. All of you will find a question and answers button on the bottom of the screen. I kindly ask you to use it to present your questions, whereas there is the chat that's for greetings and things like that. The question and answers should be written in the specific bottom. Then I inform you that the meeting is recorded and will be then available on YouTube, so you can see parts that you can miss during the session. Now, if you let me, I'll share my screen. Yes. Okay. So Roadmap 2 is a project related to good practices in disaster risk management. And today, the webinar is about practices of scenario analysis in disaster risk management planning. So we are going to focus on disaster risk management planning and the use of scenarios in this field.
Danielle, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm still not seeing your screen. It says it's still sharing. It's a blank screen.
No, it's the first slide.
Now it is. Okay. There was a delay. I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
No, okay, good to know. Thank you, Mario. Tell me if you see the screen going on. Yes, thank you. Just a few words about the partners of Roadmap 2. The Italian Civil Protection Department is the coordinator. Then we have an Italian partner that is the Italian Center for Research on Risk Reduction, which is in this particular case composed by 3 affiliated entities: CIMA Foundation, Center Foundation, and Lewis Consortium. And these are 3 parts of 9 partners. Then we have the University of Stavanger from Norway, the Association for the Development of Industrial Aerodynamics from Portugal, and the University of Tartu from Estonia. The project lasts 2 years. We are coming to the end next December, and is part of the activities related to the knowledge network of the DG ECO, so the civil protection mechanism in Europe. Why Roadmap 2? Because there was also a Roadmap 1 before a Roadmap, let's say, in the first project from 21 and to 22, 2021 to 2022, we released an open source web platform known as Solution Explorer, which is the place where we put our good practices. We released periodical bulletins, thematic papers, One Vision paper, and webinars also in that case. So following these first 2 years of activity, 1 year and a half, we noticed that there were some specific challenges that still needed to be overcome. And so we proposed to continue in a Roadmap 2 to achieve progress in the construction of an active and involved community to improve knowledge, understanding, and replicability of good practices in disaster risk management. So the main objectives of Roadmap 2 are related to the establishment of a community for the European Observatory of Good Practices, so a community of experts, to improve the knowledge, understanding, and replicability of good practices in disaster risk management. And the second objective was about the knowledge building and sharing And this was done through a cycle of seminars, webinars, collaborative workshops, and so on. And all of this is part of the European Union Civil Protection Knowledge Network. Very briefly, in short, we have 5 work packages. The first one is related to the project management, of course. The second one is devoted to the building of the community for the European Observatory of Good Practices. You will see that each of the work package is related to the other ones. The third one is related to the definition of the framework for identifying and assessing good practices in disaster management. And we also worked on example scenarios that were useful. We will see also for exercises and other activities. We will see this later. Work package 4 was about the Solutions Explorer. So we updated this important tool to collect and retrieve good practices. And here you have the link to enter this Solutions Explorer. That's available. It's publicly available. And the 5th work package is finally related to the knowledge sharing in general. In this work package, we produce collaborative workshops, 2 collaborative workshops, very successful. Webinars, 3 webinars, and this is the 3rd one today. Test exercises, the website and social media, and flash reports. All of this is available on the website of the project. Here you can see the link. And with this, I stop here and I leave the floor to Kathy. And please go on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this introduction, Daniela. I am Kati Orru from University of Tartu, and I am coordinating this workshop or webinar. And we have been from Tartu University, we have been leading also a small research group on risk and resilience, and particularly focusing on disaster governance and societal resilience aspects. So we are very thrilled to have you and have very, very good speakers joining us from all over the world today. And we are grateful for your presence and excited about the global perspectives that you bring. So why we are focusing today on the scenario analysis is that actually modern crises and disasters are, of course, very complex. And so preparing for these new risks requires proper risk assessments and that also use the scenario analysis. So scenarios can help us to explore how different risks might affect societies and also demonstrate us how resilient our communities are. And test also the organizational capacities to adapt to future changes or abrupt worst-case scenarios. But also they are very useful in order to facilitate discussion among the different stakeholders about these plausible futures and events, and also foster agreement between the different parties on their different roles in addressing these situations proactively or during the crisis event itself. So also we follow in putting or calling this webinar, we also follow this European Union disaster resilience goals that very much emphasize the aspect of anticipating and improving the abilities of risk assessment and disaster planning through anticipating and better improved seeing the future hazards and possible scenarios. So today we are going to look at particular questions on what scenario analysis practices are used in disaster management and civil protection. And all these practices of using the scenario techniques particularly useful, why they have proven particularly useful for the disaster risk management practitioners. And we are also hearing from the perspective of academic colleagues. So let me introduce the first session, and I will go through the today's speakers. So first we will have Janice Rogers. She's a Chief Operating Officer from GeoHazards International, and she's specializing in developing of solutions to threats to communities, particularly on natural hazards and climate impacts. And she has led several disaster scenario developments, vulnerability assessments, and particularly related to earthquake safety and capacity building related to that, and in very large geographic scope, starting from Asia, Pacific to Americas and Middle East even. So we will hear her talk first, a very practical kind of insights from the ground of implementing the scenario techniques. Then we will have a next speaker, who is Maria Polese from University of Naples, and she's an expert in vulnerability and seismic vulnerability and crisis management. And she also coordinates several projects related to cross-border multi-risk assessment. But then we will go into these roadmap 2 projects, scenario analysis and local exercises where we tried out the various scenario techniques. So we will have, including me, I will be presenting as well from Estonian experiences, but we will have Claudia Moorschut from University of Stavanger, and she will be focusing on and she has, just to give a bit of her background, she's associate professor in University of Stavanger and focuses on European Union crisis management and climate change securitization and adaptation issues. And she has been publishing extensively on European Union civil protection issues. Then we have Domingos Viegas from Portugal, and he's an invited full professor at the University of Coimbra and an expert in extreme fire behavior and safety. And he has led several international conferences and trainings, particularly focusing on the forest fires. And he coordinates the Center of Forest Fire Research in Adai, and they will speak and introduce themselves even more when they start speaking. But now let's welcome our first speaker, Janice Rogers. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Oru. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see that? See my screen? Yes? Okay. All right, so thank you again to the Roadmap 2 team for inviting me to share some work that my colleagues and I have been doing during a 4-year effort to better understand how disaster scenarios and in this case, scenarios depicting geologic hazard events can help us to mitigate disaster risk and build resilience in our communities. And what I'll be sharing today was supported by the U.S. Agency for International Development and the U.S. Geological Survey. So very quickly, GeoHazards International is a nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering communities in many different global settings, primarily low and middle income countries, to build resilience ahead of disasters and climate impacts. And we've been doing this work since 1991. Scenarios have been a big part of our practice. So what I'll be sharing today is from the practice and applied research perspective, as Professor Oru mentioned. So the effort that I'll be speaking about today has 3 parts. The first part was the applied research on what has been effective in past scenarios, specifically related to the impacts on disaster risk mitigation. And a lot of what we may hear today is more related to the preparedness and response readiness aspect, but this work was specifically looking at risk mitigation. Then we took what we learned to develop some practice advances, and now we are applying those in a scenario project in Thimphu in Bhutan. We do have some guidance documents for the second part, and those are available at this QR code on the right-hand side of the screen. So this is what I'm sharing is the work of a lot of people, and it's too numerous. The people are too numerous to name individually, but we have people from all over the world who worked on this project, researchers and practitioners from many different technical disciplines. So I wanted to start with a definition because a lot of professionals use the term scenario in a lot of different ways. These are flexible tools that many people use in different ways. So what we're considering in the work I'll be speaking about today, scenarios are work that examines and depicts the impacts that a plausible but hypothetical hazard event or other significant occurrence would inflict on people, the built environment, and built-in natural environments and or society. And so in this work, we're considering scenarios that have three essential components. First, there's the science-based assessment of the selected hazard event, then an estimate of what happens in the built environment, that damage, and that's got to be based on engineering or scientific principles, and then an estimate or description of the consequences, both of that damage, but also of the hazard event to people directly, particularly when you're thinking about like volcanic hazards, those hazards impacting people directly. Now, each one of those we'd consider a component. So for example, if you had a hazard map for volcanic hazards or a shake map for earthquakes, we'd consider that a component rather than considering that a scenario. So just to keep that in mind, when I'm speaking about scenarios, I'm talking about something that's got all of these components. So I just want to note a few things about the scope and methods here. The research part, we were really looking again at mitigation and not an emergency preparedness exercise uses. We feel like those are much better understood. The geologic hazards we're considering are earthquakes, volcanoes, and landslides. Our data sources were 158 interviews across 4 countries, combined with a global literature review, and really looking at what's available publicly. And then in terms of guidance development, we took those research results, we had some workshops, and then we did something called a write shop. It's an interactive process to create documents. If you've been a part of one of those, it's very interesting. But that was how we developed our practitioner guidance. And while this is really developed for geologic hazards, a lot of the processes and principles are applicable to all different types of hazards. So these are the interview sites. We interviewed people in California, Ecuador, Nepal, and New Zealand. And what we were looking for at these various sites were, in 2 of our primary hazards, really a body of work in terms of scenario use, and particularly scenario use for mitigation. We also did a global literature search, and we looked at, there are about 300 scenarios of geologic hazards in our database. So I just want to highlight a little bit of the evidence basis for the practice guidance I'm going to mention in a minute. So from our interviews, we really see 4 categories of critical elements that participants identified as making scenarios effective for mitigation. So those are, first of all, development processes, specifically collaboration and co-production. Then the characteristics of the scenario itself, which credibility, it was important, and that was established by the reputation and standards of the agency primarily, and also the quality of that specific work. And then, of course, the plausibility and realism of the events. Then the outputs really needed to be practical and applicable, and considering impacts that really mattered to end users. They need to be communicated clearly and with recommendations for what to do, and then a plan to take action. We also found it was important to have support from the external environment. That's meaning like the elected officials in the jurisdiction, or decision makers, or the media. In terms of development processes, these were really, our findings were really interesting, and this informed our guidance a lot. In terms of collaboration, this was crucial. And that was collaboration both between scientists and technical professionals to attain consensus, and also collaboration with end users to really understand what those needs are. And as one of our interviewees said, contextual knowledge is essential to good science. The co-production processes also involved stakeholders. Those were really important. And having those that co-production going kind of throughout was important. And outreach and engagement to both the public and stakeholders, and then attention to communication was very important to translate what can be pretty technical information for people who are not specialists in those fields, as many of the decision makers are not going to be. And then the technical approach was also important. The implication here is that the processes needed to be an important focus of our practice guidance. So the big question, of course, is, did scenarios actually lead to mitigation? And the answer is yes, they did, definitely. And we have a lot of examples from California where scenarios were used to advocate for specific mitigation programs. And we also see this happening in Nepal in particular. So the implication here is we want to integrate that implementation planning into the practice guidance to make that process a little smoother and a little bit more intentional. So based on all that, we developed some resources for practitioners to help take those good practices, since that's our topic today, take those good practices and put them to work, and just think about how we can be more intentional in moving towards mitigation. So these guidance documents there's a main one covering all the geologic hazards. Then there's one that's just focusing on some specific concerns related to volcanic hazards, and another one for cross-border considerations. And there's the QR code again. So we look at the guidance, we've been calling this the next generation scenarios. What is that? What does that mean? The first thing is that we take a people-centered approach to the work. And it's focused on processes rather than products, and the relationships and the conversations around risk and what can be done to improve resilience. Those are very important, and those are more emphasized rather than, say, producing a loss estimate or a report or trying to get the right answer. It's more about having those strategic conversations that open up avenues for really making change. The idea here that's a little bit different, while we still would certainly support multiple uses, is to be more intentional about the mitigation piece, so risk mitigation piece, where we can design a little bit more so that that's better supported and thought of earlier on in the process. And we're obviously incorporating what we've learned from past scenario practice, and including some practice advances and pulling things in from other fields, including risk communication and community-based disaster risk reduction and management and multi-hazard studies. That's a big pull on the practice side that we are seeing. So the framework for the guidance is that this is really meant to be a flexible resource for practitioners. There are 10 chapters of covering the main workflow activities that are grouped in 3 phases: so planning, and then co-production of the scenario, and then implementation. And we have 4 cross-cutting themes here on technical partnerships, inclusive engagement, a multi-hazard mindset, and communication. The intended users are both people who currently develop scenarios or people who are interested in working on them, and then the participants in co-production, which would include all of the people in this graphic. So here's your developers with the various technical inputs that you need, the stakeholders, which a lot of those people are from government, utility agencies, also the private sector and community organizations, and representatives of affected populations. So don't plan for us without us, that sort of idea, that we're involving everyone that we need to involve, and then the common audiences, which could be elected officials, it could be the broader community, the public, or it could be specific populations like the staff in a school. So the co-production process is really a partnership effort where people are working together to share knowledge and create knowledge, to develop the scenario outputs, and to work together on the risk problems that are that particular jurisdiction is facing. It is an inherently transdisciplinary process because you need expertise and technical input and practical input from a lot of different people, different technical disciplines, different backgrounds, to really help get good answers to the questions you're asking, both about risk and then what can be done about it. And another really critical part of this process that we hear over and over is that this supports the development of relationships between professional colleagues that are going to continue into implementation and also perhaps into response if there's an event. And that communication is really key to that. It's key throughout the effort. It's not just communicating results outward, it's within the team, it's between all the participants. And during that co-production and the next parts, the solutioning and the action planning processes, there's two-way communication that enables teaching and learning in both ways. Everyone is learning together, and some feedback loops that really keep the scenario grounded in what the community needs, what that jurisdiction needs, and then building the relationships and the trust that carry forward into implementation. And then when you have results and what could be done, then communicating to keep that scenario alive and focusing on a pathway to action. And the solutioning process this is one of my favorite parts of the process. Being an engineer, I love looking at solutions. It's collaborative problem solving to address the resilience challenges that are going to be surfaced as part of that scenario effort through conversations, through the analyses. And the participants are going to be local stakeholders and the decision makers. Often this is who was involved in creating that technical core of the scenario of what might happen for different hazards. But you might also have additional people coming in, and then technical advisors. So this might be your scenario developers, but also additional resources that could be brought, people that could be really weighing in on the problems that were identified and the challenges with potential ways to address them, and decision makers are definitely there in that mix. It can be helpful to consider some timeframes, and we think of this in sort of 3 timeframes. One is the small wins to keep momentum from the effort, getting some early progress, and then maybe the middle distance ones, and then going toward long-term solutions and institutional changes. A key, what we would term an implementation pathway, is mitigation action planning, and that's taking those ideas and solutions for improving resilience that come out of that solutioning process and putting them into a plan so that they can be implemented. So plans often range from 5 to 20 years. Maybe there's a 5-yearly revisit. It's really helpful to key these into the existing planning processes in the jurisdiction where the scenario is being developed. And it really can be a generational commitment to reframe what the community can become in terms of improving its resilience. The plan, of course, needs roles and responsibilities and a timeline, and we can think about that in the same way as was discussed for solutioning. And then implementation, which is really a primary goal of the next generation approaches, is to get to change on the ground, making people safer, making communities more resilient. And this really grows from committed partner participation, collaborative and inclusive decision-making, and a strong ally network of people who are working to move the effort forward. Partnerships, and this can be with people in the technical community, universities, professional organizations, can help advance resilience initiatives. So beyond that window that elected officials are looking at, which is pretty short term, can help to provide that longer term perspective and that continued advocacy. Because when we're talking about especially for infrequent hazards like earthquakes, we're talking about making a building safer over time, or looking at land use. It takes a long time. These are long-term nonlinear processes that require a lot of committed effort. And often we think about things in this nice linear way. This is the ideal process that we plan for, where maybe things are tied into things like the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, where we're understanding our risk and then we're determining what to do, and we're setting budgets and we're prioritizing, and then we're implementing, and everything. There's a nice cycle and scenarios are feeding into that. But really what happens in reality, what was coming out of our interviews, is something more like this process. So the implementation can be a little bit messy. We heard from our interview participants that there are a lot of other things going on. There are other events happening, the economic conditions may be going up or down. And the scenario processes that I've been describing can help us navigate this often messy reality and help us move towards a future where our built environments are more resilient and communities are safer. So where do we go from here in terms of the work that we're doing on using scenarios for mitigation? If you get a chance to look at the guidance, I would love to have your feedback on it. This is my email address, rogers@geohaz.org. So I'd love to hear what you think. If you find anything useful, let us know. We are putting the guidance into practice in Thimphu, the capital of Bhutan, shown here on the right-hand side. We're just getting going with that effort, but updates will be forthcoming. And then, of course, there will be some papers on the research underpinning this guidance that are going to be coming out, and we'll add some links from our project website once those are available. So with that, I'd like to thank the funders of this work, USAID and USGS, and thank you to everyone for their time and attention.
Thank you so much, Janice, for this very, very insightful and interesting presentation. And definitely this looks like the next generation of the scenario analysis. We have, I think we have a bit time to take a few questions that we have from the questions and answers. One of them, for example, is Lazaros Philippidis would like to know to what extent you have applied also some sort of foresight techniques of predictive forecasting tools in order to integrate these with your scenario analysis.
I would say what we typically use that might be in that category would be loss estimates for a particular scenario event or a suite of events. And that's a rather technical type of prediction. We try to not to use the word prediction because really it's illustrating what the risk issues are, because the real event will inevitably be different from whatever we imagine in the scenario. The idea is to surface what the critical risk issues, like if we know that we have, say, an earthquake risk to schools, we know that schools are vulnerable, we can show that in the scenario, we can see what the analysis is telling us. And the specific numbers of damaged schools might change a little bit from event to event, but the bottom line is we need to do something about children being at risk in these buildings. And so the foresight techniques help us to make a case for those. But the important thing is to understand fundamentally what the risk problems are. I think scenarios and those conversations that are had can help us really do that.
Thank you for this explanation. There is another very nicely related question on the, and I think this will be the last question that we can take now, but we can continue the discussion later on. One question from Dennis Fox, and he is emphasizing the unpredictableness and the crisis that actually occur due to being unimagined. And in that sense also the mitigation ideas or the mitigation principle cannot be implemented beforehand because you have never imagined it. So how he's asking that has this this unreasonable reasoning been integrated to your scenario building and scenario analysis techniques to some extent, meaning considering those unimaginable events that actually hit us the most unpredictably and most where we expect them the least, but they cause such great disturbances.
Right. Now that is a difficult problem, especially if you're talking about like black swan events. That's one category, and that's where some of these conversations can, maybe people can help imagine that. But I do think in many cases there is a scientific basis like to understand that these rare events can occur. Now, decision makers and the public may be completely unaware that this can happen, but this is really where the technical community and the hazards community can come in and explain what can happen from the science. And I think scenario processes are a helpful way to bring those possibilities up without, in a way that facilitates conversations rather than perhaps being too negative or making people just kind of shut down. I think scenarios can help us think through some of these really complicated and rare events.
Yep. Yes, that's a very good point about avoiding paralyzing the participants of these exercises and rather still being proactively thinking about their roles and their possible contributions that they can make in order to alleviate the risks or even mitigate them. I think we could try to leave some of these questions also later so that we can come back to you and also discuss with the other presenters. Thank you so much, Janice, for now, but you will join us for the discussion. But now let's turn to Maria Polese from University of Naples, and she will be speaking about multi-risk scenario building and assessment and the developments that she has made with her team. Please go ahead, Maria. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Just a moment, I will start. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Kati, for the introduction. I will start from a definition of scenarios that was proposed by the Cambridge Center for Risk Studies. So scenarios as description of plausible events that may occur in the future leading to a particular set of outcomes. They're based on assumption about key driving forces, interconnections, and relationship, and can capture uncertainties and complexities of a system in a coherent manner. Probably one thing that I want to highlight more about that is that particularly relevant in the disaster risk management perspective is that scenario analysis can be understood as the integration of scenarios into decision making. Sorry, I'm not sure if you see the top of my screen or is it correctly shared? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. So But how can effectively the scenario support disaster risk management? Actually, in different phases of the scenario, the disaster risk management. For example, to support prevention. And typically, the prevention activities includes, for example, designing on investment to select alternative mitigation actions, very close to what Janice has presented. So typically, the users of this type of scenarios are policymakers, territorial agencies, or local administrations. And for such kind of scenarios, a quantitative analysis is needed. So like, for example, by computer simulation, a lot of input data and elaborations are needed. So tools to elaborate these are quite complex scenarios, but that can give really also quantitative output. Of course, in case for other type of activities, for example, to support preparedness or to improve participation engagement, to raise awareness of the population. So the users, for example, might be students, population, those at risk, citizens group. There is no need to have too much complexity. On the other hand, scenarios should be simplified. So sort of game plan scenarios that simplify and clearly explain in simple words what is expected to happen can be sufficient and are typically used. Still in the preparedness space to improve, for example, the preparation of the response for the first responders, institutions, health department, and to use scenario for training or for exercise. We might even need scenarios that are not really quantitative, but also qualitative description of a path of what can be expected, and a sort of story can be enough. And finally, this is maybe also more connected to the question that was posed before. Scenarios that are extremely disruptive, a sort of stress test scenario, can be used to test the resilience, also to dimension capacities. For example, like the scenarios that are being developed within the framework flagship initiative responding to the anticipated disaster resilience goal for the European Union. But now, connecting to the disaster risk management cycle, I show here this picture, and this process was proposed as one of the final results of the roadmap project within a vision paper published after at the end of the roadmap project. We see here the different phases of the disaster risk management cycle: prevention, preparedness, and response. And the scenario framed in this space, looking at the events, the disaster events that, of course, precede the response that might be seen, for example, slow onset event or rapid onset event, and they might be even connected by cascading events. Interesting in this figure is also to mention that there are different management actions that we might see as good practice of disaster risk management that can improve the management, and they can be dealt at different, let's say, scales, depending on the agency that is dealing with the management of such disasters. So at a local scale, if it is a small disaster, a smaller disaster, and of course it can escalate to national, even international scale, if we have more severe type of disasters. So about multi-risk, why it is needed to have a multi-risk assessment? First of all, because to make the informed decision on priorities in risk management, it is necessary to consider all hazards and know the risks that are relevant in an area. And of course, there might be due to cascade events, for example, the impact and loss amplification. A nice overview on how multi-risk can be dealt and which can be the different nuance of treating such approach was proposed by Xiao in 2017, and we may have different levels. So in case there are more than one hazard in affecting an area, but no interaction of the hazards is considered and is relevant, we can refer to the so-called multi-layer single risk analysis that allows still to understand the relative importance of risks in a region. When the hazard interactions are considered, we refer to the so-called multi-hazard risk. And while finally, there is also interaction at the level of the vulnerability. For example, the vulnerability changes due to damage caused by another hazard. We refer to the full acceptation of multi-risk, and also cascading events, of course, entering such a process. So the quantitative assessment of multi-risk in this sense might be dealt with different approaches. For example, multi-layer single risk, it might be the simplest one, but still, of course, there is the need to have a harmonized approach and harmonized assessment procedures for all the risks in order to be able to compare such risks, which might be very different phenomena affecting the area. And I will show you an example for the European project bodies. Concerning multi-hazard risk, then the complexity arises. There are several studies that dealt with multi-hazard risk. I report here just very briefly one recent study from Iannacone et al., which classified the different kind of hazard interaction. And for example, concurrent hazard like heavy rain that can provoke a flood. Of course, the flood may follow the heavy rain. Successive triggering, when the first hazard, let's say, changes the probability of happening of the second hazard. And the classical example is an earthquake that can provoke the landslide. And then also successive altering. If for example, an earthquake and then the aftershock after the earthquake, of course, the probability of having the aftershock changes if the main shock has already happened. And here are some images, of course, how to treat these different kind of hazard and interactions. Of course, for example, one case is the probability of having one single hazard through the hazard curve. These are rate curves. But of course, if there is an alteration, for example, in the case of successive triggering, one should consider the conditional probability of having the second hazard, given that the first one has occurred. And of course, also for concurrent hazard, the joint probability distribution function should be considered and so on. So of course, it is more complex to deal with multi-hazard. And the complexity even arises in case of multi-risk. Here we see an example of event tree that might be considered starting from a triggering event, and then a number of cascade events can happen along a given path. So there might be different choices and different paths that are the so-called scenario of cascading events that can be triggered from a primary event. Of course, when quantitative assessment arises, also it is necessary to take into account the probability of having one of these alternative paths. And one approach, for example, is to consider the so-called transition matrix. So the probability reported in this matrix, each cell of the matrix represented the conditional probability of a triggered event given the triggering event. And how to calculate the elements of such matrix. There might be different approach, for example, through expert-based elicitation, quantitative analysis, or by empirical formulation, even if of course, it is quite difficult to have such kind of formulation. Here we see some example in the case of earthquake following an earthquake, where we have the so-called damage-dependent fragility. So it means that the fragility, it is not anymore for the elements in the pristine state, but we should consider fragility given a given level of that the damage has already occurred due to the first earthquake. And you see here how complex it could be to treat fully quantitatively all the issues. And so this is also the reason why there are very few applications with a multi-risk in full acceptation. I mentioned I will show you an example of multi-layer single risk assessment. On the project Boris, we deal with two different hazards, earthquake and flood, that are affecting the same area. And of course, there is the need to harmonize and standardize the assessment procedures. And this was done by referring, first of all, to the same exposed assets. And the time interval with reference to which the risk assessment is performed should be the same. And also, one thing that it might seem trivial, but it is important to clarify, is that also the metric should be the same to evaluate the risk. For example, classically, a typical metric that might be chosen are the costs, the direct costs, or expected annual loss. So for example, here we see a comparison of map of risk. These are on the left side, we have the single risk. So the risk due to earthquake and due to flood in the bottom part as expected annual loss. So a map that shows how it varies on the map. And on the right side, thanks to the fact that there wasn't a harmonization process, so we are talking about the same metric, we can also compare the risk. Otherwise, it is not feasible to have a real comparison. But now I mentioned all the issues, some of the issues that might render the multi-risk assessment really complex. So we have many assets at risk that might be affected that by single and multiple hazard. That might be hazard interaction, vulnerability interaction, cascading events, different kind of impacts. And most importantly, the stakeholders might be interested in different kind of consequences. So they might be interested in economic losses, or of course the value of life, the interest of preserving life, or the environmental issue to protect the environment. There might be really a lot of risks that might be deemed more relevant by the stakeholders. So this is why also might be quite very complex to deal with all these issues. So that's why there are alternative tools were proposed to deal with complexity. And I will talk about event-based storylines that they were firstly proposed in the framework of climate change, in climate change framework. They're defined as a physical, self-consistent unfolding of past events or of plausible future events or pathways. And this is an example of how a storyline can be shown to develop, starting from the happening of the hazard and the impact, and also including possible adaptation measures. So using a storyline, the risk awareness might be improved and decision-making strengthening. The uncertainty can be partitioned, and also the boundary of plausibility can be explored. And I want to mention that within the Return project, which was is a project financed by Next Generation EU in Italy, an extension of the use of event-based storyline was proposed for preliminary evaluation of impact and risk assessment, considering complex multi-hazard and multi-risk scenarios that are deemed relevant by stakeholders. So which are the steps to build such storylines? First of all, it is necessary to define the context. So, and this is the first part that is mainly in charge of the, let's say, of the expert and let's say that are starting the process to build such storylines. So define the context, giving basic explanation on where we are and which are the basic features. And of course, introduce the multi-hazard event that might be relevant to evaluate in such a context. So here we have an example of an earthquake followed by a tsunami because we are in a coastal area. And then provide a story, a basic narrative of what can happen, a sort of how the event unfolds and what is expected to happen. Then there is a collaborative approach to develop storyline. Now, very much in line to what was presented also by Janice, it is necessary to involve stakeholders in the construction of such storylines in order to build the full path of a scenario, including all the things that are relevant to describe the scenario. So which are the exposed assets at risk? We can have thousands of different kind of assets, but maybe the stakeholder is interested just on some of those exposed assets at risk. Then also, which are the relevant vulnerabilities and the causal relationships? Which are the impacts and the relevant risks? And also the possible disaster risk management actions that can be taken into consideration. And I want to mention here, because here we are, of course, in the framework of the roadmap project where the good practice are assessed. How to evaluate another question if such disaster risk management actions are effectively good practices. Now we see a lot of elements that should be considered in the building of a scenario. So the context, the multi-hazard event, the story, the narrative, and a number of elements that enter in the description of the scenario that might be even needed as a quantitative input in case a quantitative assessment is performed. So starting from this overview of what are the needs, we tried within the roadmap project, we proposed a scenario description form. It is a sort of memorandum of all the steps, what is needed to build a scenario. Of course, this does not guarantee the building of a scenario, but at least to not forget what might be relevant to include in the description of a scenario. So this form is a sort of step-by-step guide for compiling a scenario. And I had as a tool for assessment of good practice in multi-risk framework. Here at the bottom, it is mentioned the name of the deliverable of the roadmap project that can be found online where there is the description of this form. So why they can be used as tools? Because they are using local exercise to discuss disaster risk management actions with relevant stakeholders, and they can assess if such actions are effectively good practices. So this assessment happens in the final part of the form, where after the scenario is presented, the stakeholder can give answers about the actions, about their effectiveness. So, for example, to what extent does the good practice achieve the desired outcome? The reach, to what extent does the good practice affect the intended and critical target population, and so on. So this is explained in a framework for identifying and assessing good practices in disaster risk management, which is another deliverable of the roadmap project. Now, I will conclude with a short example of an application of this methodology in Friuli, where a multi-hazard event, a flood followed by an earthquake, was expected. And the good practice that we tested are, let's say, connected to the prevention phase, so reinforcement of river levees to prevent flooding and seismic retrofit of buildings to reduce the damage. And they can be evaluated with analytical methods, so a quantitative assessment was performed. Then there are also other practices, but the preparedness phase, but I will not linger on that. So the multi-risk scenario I mentioned, this is in the area of Pordenone. So this is the context, and this is the basic flood and seismic hazard in the area, as well as some basic information on the kind of exposure. And the flood hazard comes from a previous event, for a flood event in 2002. And while the seismic hazard was simulated, hypothesizing an event of magnitude 6 event at the fire fault of Cansiglio, and the PGA intensity distribution was evaluated with OpenQuake. So finally, before the final assessment, it was necessary to determine the impact. So of having performed quantitative assessment, it was also possible to evaluate the number of buildings, for example, in the flooded area, the affected population, the streets that were flooded, and due to earthquake, the expected damage on, so the collapsed building, unusable buildings, and so on, the population that need to leave their houses. And then the second scenario was run considering the application of the mitigation actions. So the building of a levee and the retrofit of buildings, the seismic retrofit of buildings. And let's say the same metric was evaluated, but with a change scenario. So the reduced number of buildings in the flooded area, reduced affected population, and of course, a reduction in the damage of buildings. So the final part is the assessment that so stakeholders are questioned through quantitative assessment, of course, facilitates this kind of assessment. So what is expected is, of course, at final the inundated area, for example, due to the flood, is smaller. There are less unusable roads, and there's a reduction of inundated waiting areas. And so it can be expected that there is a high effectiveness and reach of this kind of intervention. And similarly for what concerns the retrofit of buildings, the seismic retrofit of buildings. Okay, I conclude here. I was maybe very quick, but I hope, of course, if there are questions, I'm here to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for this very systematic overview of the very structured and nice way to formulate and guide the formulation of scenarios. We have a few questions actually. First of all, Jean-Paul Monet has stated a question regarding how operationally useful is such a perspective to scenario analysis that you are proposing. To what extent can it be used also to guide the decisions in response phase?
Actually, scenario to guide decision in response phase, I do not see it really in the actual response, but on the other hand, on the preparing the response. So scenarios are a tool that can be, let's say, available before, and so to improve the preparedness, to analyze and to test. So there are different phases. On one hand, to have a real preparation of the response. So also, for example, dimensioning the capacity. How many means do I need to organize a response in case of a certain scenario? On the other hand, of course, there is the training and exercise phase. So in this sense, even scenarios like stories and hypotheses of path of what could happen are certainly a help to practically organize trainings and drills to enhance the preparedness of the people involved in the response.
Thanks for this clarification. I hope, yeah, someone is raising, kind of waving the hand. So I hope that Jean-Paul is also happy with the response. There is one question about if and whether this framework that you propose also could help to distinguish between the multi-hazard and multi-risk concept. And do you see the difference and in the ways we should be conceptualizing these at all in the frames of this scenario analysis?
Actually,
multi-hazard, yeah.
Actually, well, the framework, let's say the scenario description form, it is, let's say, it is a form that supports in the building of the scenario. And I did not go too much in the details, but there are some parts where the input, the specific input is asked in the sense, of course, for example, distinguishing the kind of interaction of the hazard. So if there is interaction of the hazard, which kind of interaction, if they're concurring, triggering, and so on. So this might be defined. But then when it comes to the practical assessment, very much depends on how much one wants to go with the quantitative assessment and the probabilistic assessment and how to take into account this. So if there is hazard, only hazard interaction, but not interaction at the vulnerability level, that maybe, of course, this changes the probability of happening of these multi-hazard events, and it affects also the probability of happening of the entire scenario. But then when we look more at the effects, what are the real impacts, this might be affected by the change of vulnerability that, of course, it might, and also of the triggering of different kind of effects due to this cascading effects. So this final part should look more also on the change of vulnerability, on the fact that the exposed system changes in time. It is not the same during when a disrupting event happens. So this is quite complex, but of course it is another issue to be considered. That is why this, let's say, this storyline approach can help in partitioning the uncertainty and to still deal with, because otherwise, as also Janice mentioned, we wave our hand, we cannot do anything because it is too complex to understand. So a way to start to reasoning and be aware of what can happen and think about the unthinkable. This is the approach.
Thank you for this explanation. I think it's appropriate also now to show some of the other examples of the scenarios that we have built in the frames of and with the help of this roadmap project, and where we have also applied them in other country contexts. So we saw from Maria's presentation the Italian exercise and its results, but I will demonstrate some of the findings from Estonian exercise and then move on to the Norwegian and Portuguese exercises. I will share my screen. Yes, I hope you can see my screen now.
Yes.
Yes, and I will put the, yeah, good. So I will be talking about the application of multi-risk scenarios in our local exercises, and I will start from the Estonian exercise, and then Claudia will talk about the Norwegian exercise. To move to the next slide. For some reason, the presentation doesn't.
If you click with the mouse on the screen that you are sharing, we should help you to go on. Try.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I got it. Thank you, Daniela. Yes. So we took a scenario related to a cyber attack, and the aim was to define the measures to support the coping of the affected populations, of course, and why is this cyber attack scenario so close to us is actually, of course, that Estonia is one of the most one of the countries where all sorts of kind of database solutions are very much applied in all sorts of government authorities and our everyday businesses, including the provision of various kind of support schemes to the vulnerable groups. So our scenario actually combined these two aspects of very vulnerable database systems and that are being kind of tested and bombarded by our adversaries constantly, and there are hundreds and hundreds of trials to get through the kind of cyber systems of our Estonian authorities daily, and of course this is very important problem to also to our to the crisis heads of our national authorities. And in this case, we were tailoring a scenario around Estonian state social protection authority, and they were helping to put together this scenario for analysis. So the particular scenario itself is about the cyber attack on information systems to the social protection authority, the information systems concerning the different databases of people who receive various kinds of pensions or support, financial support from the state authority. These information systems are compromised. Plus, to make it more complicated and even more kind of more likely and more closer to the actual real life situations, the disruptions in the telecommunication functions, telecommunication companies' functions are foreseen in this scenario. And as a result of that, pension payments cannot be made. The calculations are erroneous, and which leads to hundreds of millions of euros remaining unpaid. And of course, there are complications to the vulnerable groups that are so dependent on these funds and allocations from the state authority. Additional complications that we saw in this scenario were also concerning the misinformation and the erroneous message posted on social media from the account of the authority, from the same authority that is responsible for delivering the timely pensions and allowances to the people that need those. So as a result, people would not react appropriately. They would continue spending as they would normally do, until they realized that actually the funds are not still coming to their bank accounts, and protests grow into riots in some places. And to make the context even more clear, the scenario actually involves the whole Estonia, the whole country, basically. So hundreds and thousands of people who are actually do not get the funds that they are supposed to get monthly. As a result of that, many of those people cannot buy medicines, they cannot buy the necessary services that they need, they cannot even buy food. That's also foreseen for some groups. In this scenario, we also foresaw that hospital emergency departments and local government support is overwhelmed, because people will go and turn to get their medications from the hospital emergency departments, and to get their emergency support from the local government, emergency food or any other support that local government can offer. So these services are definitely overwhelmed. So what kind of implications this would have on the different population groups? This was our one of the key questions in this exercise, and we also combined our sort of good practices testing also around these vulnerable groups, defining the vulnerable groups. And we used as one of those good practices that we wanted to test out was the vulnerability triage model that we have elaborated in collaboration with the Estonian Rescue Board earlier in various projects, and we have applied it in several disaster scenario analysis. So what this model of triage actually is so helpful about is the prioritization of the people who would need attention or some sort of help from any of the authorities or any communities. So, but before ending up with this list of people or list of groups of people that would, systematically considered a range of different population groups that would need attention with in a triage form, prioritizing also the time the time range when they should be attended or when the support should reach them. So what we did is that is the sort of further elaboration of the scenario by very clearly mapping out the different the current crisis situation and crisis conditions. So mapping out the direct hazards that this postponement or severe postponement of the pensions and allowances would cause. We also mapped out the different malfunctionings of vital services, including the infrastructures or the medical and social care disturbances for example, from the local governments or from the hospitals. So all of these were very clearly laid out and discussed with these multiplicity of stakeholders that we had behind the table to discuss through these crisis conditions. We discovered was the communication failures. So the communication failures as also a source of hazard to these population groups, including the accessibility or understandability of the communication, or is even also the trust issues that might raise in such a situation. So in the next phase with this triage model, we just opposed this very detailed and description of the situation to the list of various vulnerable groups, including also those that have some pre-medical conditions or the ones who might develop medical conditions in the hazard situation that was under discussion. We also mapped the people or groups that have some pre-existing material difficulties, or the people who, due to the situation of this cyber attack and not being able to use the funds that they are normally used to, being at our disposal. What are the material consequences and the groups that are most affected by this disruption of the funds that they are expecting? And of course, all sorts of communication-related and attitudinal problems that people, some of the groups that might have issues with authorities and have caused these riots on the streets in this scenario, and some of the kind of these disruptions might also be stemming from the issue that people that have normally trusted the authorities are now under the influence of this misinformation that is spread out in the social media. So we discussed these very various groups and the effects of the crisis conditions on these groups specifically, and very systematically going through the different groups. And finally, what we end up with was the prioritization of how urgently is help needed to these various groups, and which type of help is needed, and who has to help. And also what we have been discussing is to what extent we can prepare for such events in terms of our mitigation and preparedness actions. So here is the list of the various groups that were pointed out as the most needy in such scenario. The users of life-critical medications, for example, who would need attention immediately, and they would need, we also specified in this exercise, what type of support is needed for them. This is medical material, but also psychosocial aid, and primarily also the information. So getting the correct information across was considered the most important, and who should be responsible and who should be ready to provide this support. This was also discussed and mapped out, and also the local government responsibility representatives felt our responsibility here, and also the hospital representatives that were engaged in the exercise also recognized our role in stepping in terms of supporting these this particular vulnerable group. But of course, there were many other groups that were also discussed and prioritized, but I'm just making one example here. One important aspect also is that we defined in this, using this triage model, was also defining the data sources based on what we could also, based on anonymized data, also get an understanding of how many people in such life-critical medical situation would be in such a situation, and to understand how much preparedness actions we would need to be putting into place in order to avoid such critical situations from appearing. So all in all, this proved for the stakeholders involved an effective way of prioritizing the different groups that could be affected. It also brings a bit more systematicity in the analysis of the vulnerable, of the societal vulnerability. So rather than thinking of these sort of usual suspects of elderly and and people with or less secure households as the most needing people. This sort of model of analysis also helped us to look for the vulnerabilities in other domains and from other domains of vulnerabilities. So all in all, this was considered as a nicely transferable model also to other crisis situations, which we have also tried out practically. So that's all from our Estonian perspective and Estonian experience in using this multi-hazard scenario analysis. But I will now give the floor straight to Claudia Morshoot from Stavanger University to describe the Norwegian exercise and its results.
Hello everybody. I will briefly tell you about the scenario we use in Norway, which is probably the simplest scenario we have used in this project to test good practices. It's a quite simple storytelling that the Norwegian Civil Defense District here in the Rogaland County provided us. With the aim was to train the personnel of the civil defense, the regional civil defense, to cope with multiple crises. And this scenario was applied in a local exercise that ran between the 3rd and the 6th of June 24. And this local exercise was called Sworn in the Mountain, a clear historical reference to the Battle of Hafrsfjord that happened in 872, when King Harald the Fair Hair unified Norway. And the scenario was, as I told you, quite simple. The regional civil defense consider a war scenario, a military attack, where the Finnmark county in the north of Norway was in a way invaded, and the Rogaland country, situated in the southwest of Norway, was in a way very heavily affected and impacted. For those who are not familiar with the Norwegian geography, Finnmark is in the northernmost and easternmost county, is the second largest county, and is the least populated Norwegian county with about 75,000 inhabitants. Whereas the county of Rogaland, where Stavanger is the capital city, is situated in the southwest part of Norway, and it has a large population of about 500,000 inhabitants. The scenario, in a way, to make the scenario quite realistic and up to the goal to train the personnel to cope also with stress and sudden negative events. There were some additional complications added into the scenario that you can read. There were, in a way, online campaigns to provoke with a lot of misinformation, to provoke in the local population in the region a sense of insecurity and discontent. Kati, you can move to the next. Thank you. The scenario foresaw also several negative impacts, sabotages, and one in particular of the impacts was very much at the core of this local exercise, how to receive higher and higher numbers of internal displaced population coming from the Finnmark county to the Rogaland county, imagining that these inhabitants were literally leaving everything behind. So they were coming to the south of Norway with no means, with no and in need then of food and shelter. And another impact that local personnel had to deal with was this supply chain disruptions, with a situation where it was more and more difficult to access medicines and food. During the local exercise, there were several members of the personnel, both some sitting in the headquarters and some on the ground, that in a way activated several measures of response in terms of preparedness and internal response to the various needs of the population. And the local exercise consisting in actually fully mobilizing the regional civil defense. And the internal response was consisting in a way in coping not only with this military crisis scenario, but with also, let's say, several risks and hazards that can happen in the daily, let's say, response of the civil defense. So there were oil spills, there were fires, not in a way directly related to the military attack or as impacts due to the conflict. And this in a way created in the local exercise a situation where the personnel was really put under pressure to respond properly and promptly. Next, please. During through the implementation of this scenario in the local exercise, the regional civil defense asked us from the University of Stavanger to, in a way, test good practices in 3 main areas, because these were the areas deemed relevant to improve the local civil defense response. Situational awareness, and situational awareness didn't concern only the situational awareness within the civil defense, which was in a way steering the local exercise in the headquarters of the civil defense, but also between the personnel of the civil defense and all the actors on the ground, which were the Red Cross, firefighters, but also journalists. Then the second main area was the communication. And again, the important issue here for the local civil defense was to test, again, communication within the members of the civil defense in the headquarters, but also with the actors on the ground. And then the third good practice area that we tested and then we have started to analyze is the process of evaluation of these scenarios applied to local exercise. And this was deemed particularly important for the civil defense, since the personnel itself consider that often the process of evaluation is a bit neglected. So the scenario is applied, the local exercise is implemented. There is a hot wash moment where the participants discuss what went well, what went wrong, and that's it. Whereas the civil defense chiefs consider that the process of evaluation is of paramount important to really gather knowledge and understanding, and then implement good practices in the next local exercise. And I stop here and I give the word to my colleague Domingos Viegas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudia. And I will stop sharing and give the word to Domingos.
Thank you very much, Betty. Good morning, everyone. I'm talking from Portugal, and I will present you the exercise that we did here in central Portugal. This work was done by my colleagues from my team. The main authors are here in the title of this slide. We selected for our exercise an area in the central Portugal that is in the Lousa mountain, and we chose two risks, one related to fire, followed by heavy rains and flood. And we aim to look at the three phases of the process of risk management. For this exercise, we invited a group of stakeholders participating in the management of the risks at these three levels, and also at the various scales, from national, regional, and local scale. And we asked them to identify good practices in their respective roles to better handle the risks that are dealt with in the scenario. The stakeholders that accepted our invitation, actually all of them who we invited, they accepted. And they are listed here. There are some national agencies, but also local managers and even private enterprise. And the scenario that we defined is in a region nearby Coimbra, a mountain of Lousa, which is very forested and has several villages and critical infrastructures. And it is potentially can be affected by fires. And this is a very mountainous area. It is part of Natura 2000 network, and it is very seeked for tourism. Here are some pictures of the area where you can see the beauty of the scenery, and it is an area that we know very well. In this part, there are several historical villages that are not very much occupied during the year. These are the number of inhabitants of each one during the year, but in the summer they may have several tens or even hundreds of people that go and live there for touristic purposes. And we know this area also for the forest cover. This is something that we have been studying for several years. And we know also that although it is a potentially dangerous area, it has not been affected by fires in recent years, in the past 20 years. So this means that there is a great accumulation of fuel. In some places it is managed, but in some places it's not so much. We created a scenario of two events, one a fire in a certain day of the year, and followed by intense rainfall a few days later. These are what we call a cascading effect, because the fire provoked the effects of the floods. We studied the propagation of fire using simulators. So what we did is something that would be, let's say, plausible, and we tried to see what would be the story of these fires and how they would evolve in the course of time, affecting the different spaces and areas in the region. After the fire, we assumed that there would be an episode of rainfall that could affect and flood some villages in the area and create problems there that had to be solved, and also landslides in some places, isolating villages and damaging the road network. This is the time frame of the events, of the different time story of the different events, and this we presented to the stakeholders. We developed this exercise in 3 stages. We started this exercise in April this year. We had a online meeting with all the invited entities, where we presented them this scenario. And then we had individual meetings with each entity to discuss with them the scenario, what they would propose to mitigate the problems and eventually to recover from them. And we plan to have next week a face-to-face meeting with all of them to discuss the outcomes that they provided us. The different agencies are listed here again. So they have national and regional and local and also a private entity that we had in participation. And all of them in dialogue with us, they identified some good practices that they have already implemented or they are implementing. And some of these good practices were proposed by more than one agency. And here is a full list of the good practices that they proposed. So there were in all 33. But looking at them, let's say, we summarized because some of them were common, and we listed these 14 good practices at different stages of the process. And we have here also the self-assessment or self-evaluation of each good practice done by the entities and together by us. So we find that most of them are effective, are let's say are sustainable, are relevant, and they can be transferable to other places. And we are now in the process of preparing the templates for each one of these good practices. Here are example of 3 of them that we identify: one for the prevention preparation phase, the other for the response, and the other for the recovery. For each one of them, as I said, we are preparing a description following the template that was prepared for the project that Maria Polese showed. And here is the form that we are filling for all of these 14 good practices. And this is something that we are intend to discuss with the stakeholders in a meeting that we'll have next year to see what each one of them proposed, and if they are consistent, and if they are, let's say, support all these good practices. This is another good practice in the phase of response, that things that we identified here in Portugal that are good and that eventually can be applied elsewhere in the monitoring of decision support in forest fire spread, and also in the recovery phase, the impact assessment of the slopes and the immediate emergency stabilization plans that are necessary after a fire. This has been in place in Portugal for the past years, and we think that it is working well and it is a good practice. These are just examples of some of the good practices that we identified in this exercise and that we are proposing from the project. And that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Domingos, for a very comprehensive description of a very comprehensive exercise. And I know that this has lasted for at least 3/4 of an hour, that when you have prepared it and with its various stages. Thank you. I would like to welcome all of the speakers now so that we can discuss together the questions that we have received in the questions and answer box. Yes, I see that Maria, one of the questions is targeted directly to you. Would you like to respond to that, or please also repeat the question? And
Maria, you are muted.
Okay. Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, so there was one question response, but I think I already answered. There is another, I can read This from Abbas Fatihazar that says that thank you for the question. Is from Genova. He's in Genova, stays in Genova. He says here we are currently focuses on integrated multi-hazard risk reduction measures for floods and earthquakes. My first question is for all presenters, so including me. In your experience, did you find it necessary to shift from hazard-specific measures to broader hazard-independent approaches that address systemic vulnerabilities? If yes, what steps would you recommend for transitioning from hazard-specific to hazard-independent strategies? So this is a very interesting question, of course, very relevant when dealing with the planning, let's say, for mitigation and in general for action in the prevention phase. I believe it's mainly related to prevention phase. And when dealing with multi-hazard as a first step, probably also the multi-layer single risk assessment is appropriate in order to understand the relevance of the different hazards on the territory. So a first step of the analysis would be to highlight it, to identify hotspots and where the different hazards mostly affect, even separately, even if there are no interactions. Of course, if there are interactions, the impact might be even increased. So this is the first part of the analysis that should be considered. And then when dealing and possibly thinking about actions to mitigate and to also adapt from in a multi-hazard perspective, there is the need to evaluate which are the benefits of possible actions that can be put in place. For example, if we refer to buildings and the retrofit, the seismic retrofit of buildings, of course, we know that we reduce the potential damage because we reduce the vulnerability of buildings. But at the same time, this if we look from another perspective, if we look, for example, at the urban heat island or other the things that there might be other risks, that the risk to having too much on heat island, so the heat wave is impacting many of our cities. So that intervention that we are making to seismic retrofit, is it contemporarily effective also to have a climate-proof action? Does it reduce the what is the energy consumption of the building? Or at the same time, we are investing some money on it. So if the building is, at the same time, if we do energy, some intervention that reduce the energy consumption without retrofitting the building, we increase the value, the monetary value of the building, and but in case of a seismic event, we can increase the losses. So there is the need to have, an integrated and strategic view of what are the effects. Also including the flood, you mentioned the systemic vulnerability. So of course, there is the need to have an evaluation, which is the systemic performance, and to include all the measures. And finally, I don't want to talk more, but just to mention that the multi-criteria analysis should be taken into account, because of course the needs and what are the effects for the stakeholders and for the people that are planning should be considered in a holistic view, so taking into account all the effects, and in multi-criteria analysis can be of help in taking some decisions and to think what should be preferred.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. Daniela, you would like to add or specify or contradict?
No, I have another question. So if you want to go ahead on this topic, I wait. Otherwise, I have a question to Janice, for Janice.
Yes, so maybe we can try to finish with this question. Does anyone would anyone of the speakers like to add anything regarding this, whether we should focus on hazard-specific measures or hazard-independent approaches to address systemic vulnerabilities. Any comments regarding that? I can comment from our perspective, from our Estonian exercise perspective and the use of these vulnerability triage model. This seems definitely as one of the models that is hazard independent approach, where basically it's very dependent on the hazard, but it can be used in very various hazard conditions and trying to systematically map out those different intermediating and well connecting hazard conditions that lead to the vulnerabilities to various groups, and the tool basically helps to map out and prioritize these various groups that can be affected in any disaster situations, and primarily, of course, this can be done in a sort of preparedness or cold phase, when there is time to elaborate on these scenarios and think through also the vulnerable groups and their support needs, and also support needs in terms of preparedness building, or even mitigation of these risks to these groups from appearing. So that's my take on this, whether these approaches can be hazard independent or focusing on only one hazard. But maybe let's go to Daniela's question.
Domingos raised his hand before, maybe on this.
No,
Yes.
Thank you, Daniela. Actually, I raised my hand because I would like to comment on the question that was made by Lazaros Philippidis. But you, Kati, also wanted to reply to this question. I don't know if you want to go first, or shall I comment?
Actually, I think I already tried to respond also to Lazaros Philippidis' question, and stating that actually this vulnerability analysis, basically, yes, I absolutely agree that this vulnerability triage, it would be perfect to be conducted also in this preparedness and cold phase, thinking through the scenarios, and then analyzing and exploring with the range of stakeholders, who are the most affected groups, and what could be the prioritization among them in terms of the support, necessary support, and types of support necessary. But of course, for example, during the COVID period, we had also a possibility to apply this analysis tool, and in such a very long-term crisis situation, this can be also very helpful in terms of kind of shifting through and sieving through the different groups and our vulnerabilities and the prioritization among the groups that have become vulnerable compared to the situation maybe two weeks ahead or 2 weeks away from the current situation. So in that sense, in the longer term disaster situation that spans across maybe many weeks or months, then it's really definitely worth trying and using this vulnerability analysis in several time points to have a sort of a checkup of how the vulnerabilities have evolved. But I will, please, Domingos, you would also like to comment on Lazaros' question.
Thank you, Kati. Just to say that I fully agree with Lazaros that these exercises have several things that you said there in your comment. For example, in our fire exercise, we found that one of the most recognized practices is the preparation of the communities to face these sort of events. And as you say, there can be different plausible scenarios happening. We proposed one that is quite a dangerous one, but there could be other ones. And it was identified that the preparation of the communities, the working with them, was one of the best practices. And also you mentioned the use of real-time capacity to predict. And this is something that is being developed in Portugal. Let's say people supporting technically the prediction of the fire's evolution and planning its suppression in the safety, also plan ahead the evacuation of villages if necessary. And finally, as these events very often result in floods or in landslides, there is also a plan to recover, to protect the slopes and to avoid these sort of events. And these were three good practices that were identified and are examples of others that can be. And these are all listed also in your comment to these aspects. Thank you.
Thank you, Domingos. Maybe let's turn to Daniela's question. You wanted to address the question to Janice, please.
Yeah, I have two questions. First of all, thank you very much. Your presentation was very inspiring. I noticed the first question is about the scientific consensus. You mentioned the need to collaborate to build a scientific consensus. This is quite important to us because in Italy, in our civil protection code, we have the code says that the scientific community participates in the National Civil Protection Service through the integration in civil protection activities of knowledge and products deriving from research and innovation activities, which have reached a level of maturity and consensus recognized by scientific community according to the practices in use. So we recognize that there is always a discussion in the scientific community. There are different points of view, and this is part of the Galilean approach to the research, so good. But at the end, we have to decide basing on an idea, a project, a scenario on which we have a scientific consensus. So my first question is, what is your experience on trying to reach this consensus in your activity? And the second question is in a way connected. It is how to obtain a committed partner participation. So in both cases, how can you reach these results? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Those are great questions. Regarding scientific consensus, there's a couple of things. So the first is that you have to get people, the idea is to get people that might have even a little bit differing opinion in a room to agree kind of offline before you say anything publicly, because if you have these disagreements in the public, then people don't believe you. And this actually happened on an effort in San Francisco in the mid-2000s, and they had some problems with credibility until they could get some commissions and get that process where they were speaking with one voice about what the risk was, because a lot of the technical details maybe don't matter so much to the decision makers. It's more the scientists that are having those discussions. So that can be contained without talking to the public. The other aspect, and when we are working, say in an area with low information, is to get people to, again, have a discussion and a conversation amongst the team to choose events that make sense and have that collaboration. So I think for consensus building, there are some other aspects, like the USGS uses a lot of peer review and some very lengthy processes to get to that consensus. Depending on your resourcing, that may not be as practical, and you can maybe have to have more conversations. The second question, getting committed partnership. This is the heart of the matter, really, and who can make a difference. And cultivating people who have an interest, who we would call advocates or champions, and really continuing to work with them and invest in working with them, connecting them with others who are like-minded, and building something over time. That's something that's been successful to us, because it's the people on the ground locally that are working there over time that are really going to make the difference. Thank you.
Thank you. Janice, maybe you can continue with some of the questions that are still up in the chat or in the questions. So first question about the mapping of interdependencies and criticalities in the scenario development process. How far can you go with the details, and how many aspects and nuances can you include to make it still?
Yeah, this is I think ultimately it's a judgment call based on the resources that you have. But what's important, like Maria was mentioning, you can't model a lot of these things well, or at least not do that economically. But to have the conversations about the interdependencies and, we won't have power for how long? And then planning needs to be adjusted. So I think having at least a basic level of mapping out what the interdependencies are and having the conversations is very important. But how you go down into that, I agree, you can really get into a lot of complexity. One approach that we use is to describe with narrative things that we can't model, so that people at least are aware of what may happen and they can start thinking and planning. Because a lot of times people are not aware of what those interdependencies are.
Thank you. And I think we can take just one more question before we need to finish. But this is also very, very exciting question from Abbas Fatih-Azar about I lost the question. No, actually, that was a very interesting question that I think we have lost from the question and answers. But it was related to the implementability of the results from the exercises. I think this is something that Janice, you touched upon, or you mentioned you expressed it as solution orientedness, or how did you put it, Janice? So basically, one concern from yes. Okay. Yeah, sorry. One of the earlier questions that we had, and I think it wasn't answered, but it's quite intriguing. You know, how useful and to what extent the scenario analysis results are actually followed up with actual implemented solutions and implemented actions for mitigating the hazards from occurring. Does anyone want to comment on that? And how can we make sure that these discussions and the scenario analysis techniques and the results are actually followed up and are sort of into an actual practice in terms of solutions?
I think for mitigation, the key is really getting what you recommend and into an action plan. And that's where that planning process comes in with the decision makers. And then if you can tie that into an existing planning process, that's where you really start to leverage the systems that are already in place. So that's been key. If you just have some recommendations in a report, that tends to not be as effective as now you've got a plan and you have responsibilities and timelines and you've identified resources. So that we found that to be a key helpful step in getting things implemented.
That sounds like a very, very good and concrete action plan, and that can be also monitored and followed up even after years of the passing after the exercise itself. So yeah. Is there any other comments from our speakers? I think we can close here just to be on time, and I'm really very, very thankful for all the speakers and for presenting their work, and of course for all the participants who actively stated their questions and made the session even more livelier. Thank you so much for all your contributions, and I look forward to seeing you in other venues and also in other roadmap events that are still coming up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and see you soon. Bye bye.
Bye bye.